All right, let's now bring in a Social Policy Initiative Executive Director, Isobel Frye, who joins us now just to discuss this further. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon, Isobel. So what are some of the key highlights for you, that we can take out from this recent survey, especially as it relates to South Africa's reliance on social grants, which has increased, as we've just heard in that clip?
Thank you, Anati. And I applaud Stats SA. I think this is another very significant contribution to knowing who we are as a nation. The statistic that I'd like to start with is, however, hunger. And what we've seen is that 23% of South Africans are either subject to inadequate food access or severely inadequate food access. Now, if you take that figure of 23% and you then correlate that to the household income source, it's really interesting because that 23% really looks quite similar to the 23% of South Africans who rely on grants as the main source of income. So the question that we need to be asking ourselves is the amount of the grant income sufficient to enable people to move out of hunger and into a stage of potentially creating and developing their own sources of income? Or is the grant income too little to do that? So that's the one question. I think, Unati, the other point that really emerged for me from the survey is the burden that rests on women in South Africa. Firstly, more children live with their mother than with any other parent, including both parents. So we're looking at women being the sole parent for many of the children of South Africa. And so that's 45.4%. And secondly, that more than 2/5 of all households are female-headed, and most of those are in rural areas. So we get the picture of women-headed households in extreme poverty, where hunger is a daily occurrence. And the lack of salaries coming in order to augment the social grant income. The other interesting thing was that in this year's General Household Survey, there was no specific section looking at social security. Last year, we got quite a lot of information on the COVID grant income through the section on social security, but that's been removed. So we're just looking at the general income and asset section. But I think what we see is that whether it is a policy that is in favour or not, there is a significant number of South Africans who are dependent on grant income, and we need to be looking at, as I said, the question, is that enough to take our population out of hunger in order to enable them to be developmental and to reach their full potential and be productive workers?
There's a lot that you've said there that I want to just discuss, but let's perhaps start with what you said about, the women of South Africa. I mean, amid the gender pay gap that we see in this country, the survey does, in fact, reveal that at least 42% of South African households are headed by women. And I mean, you've mentioned that, those are predominantly in your rural areas. So when you then consider what you said about hunger, it brings to mind that we already know some of the, provinces that have, problems with this. I can mention the Eastern Cape, for instance, where we saw, the high levels of malnutrition, particularly amongst children. There's also Limpopo province and other provinces. I mean, what does this then tell us, about when we try to, put in systems in place that will support particularly women? And incidentally, in this coming election, we have more women that have registered to vote.
I think the question is a very complex one. I mean, for instance, you just mentioning Limpopo, I was surprised to see that majority of households in Limpopo actually are food adequate. So there you've got 93% of households are food adequate, even though they have very high levels of income poverty. So I think that in this does speak to the fact that some of the development strategies in different provinces have different ranks of success. I know that Eastern Cape, the hunger and malnutrition, as you said there, has always been historically high. to my mind, for the new administration, both at a national and a provincial level, what really would be beneficial would be an audit. We have the statistics, so it's about saying what are we used to call them the war rooms against poverty. What are the provincial policies going to be, taking in mind what is, not what we want to have, what is in terms of unemployment figures, in terms of access to production for own subsistence, and then again, jobs. We know that from the manifestos, and I've spent a bit of time looking at them, many of the political parties are promising jobs, not grants. Now, I think we've had this discussion before, that in a country where you've got 12 million people officially unemployed, to make that choice is a false binary. You can't say, do we want grants or jobs? The research that the Social Policy Initiative has brought out has shown that by flooding through a decent universal basic income of 1,500, by actually increasing both the number and the value of grants, which to many people is an anathema, we can actually come up with GDP growth of 5.6% and 2.7 million jobs. So it's about thinking differently. We know that the prescribed attempts at policy solutions that we've been applying for the last 30 years have actually seen a consistent negative trajectory. Of course, exacerbated by the 2008 financial crisis, where we saw that headed into a huge decline in well-being from 2011 onwards. And again, the COVID exogenous shock. But we are a nation that is subject to global shocks as well as our own. So the point about social security, and this is really the point that we hope political parties are going to take on board, is if you have strong systems ex ante before a shock happens, the damage on households and the ability of them to recover is far lessened. And so you recover from the shock and you proceed to grow on. But what we're seeing consistently year on year, because of the very minimal amount of the grants, is that people are not getting enough to grow their own livelihood strategies. And again, the point that I wanted to say in this general household survey is, unfortunately, last year that section on COVID was helpful. We don't have that. So I think we need to be looking at where the money is going and who it's not going to, in order to make the next step, which was like in the next administration, how do we anticipate job growth without the kind of economic stimulus that sufficient basic income really would provide?
And that's a very important, question in the sense that you want to then create, these opportunities for young people, especially, 20 plus years with grade 12 qualifications, or, that also has increased in the sense of these young people are still without jobs. And another thing that we haven't touched is, of course, child-headed households. This report also reveals that about 1/8 of children were orphaned, having lost one or both parents. What does that picture tell you about their state of affairs in terms of, this particular survey?
I think both the child-headed households, but Unati, the other statistic which is significant in terms of looking at social reproduction and parenting, is that 19%, that a fifth of South African children are raised by neither of their biological parents. So the idea that we have that parents are able to care for the children and nurture them, take them down the kind of pathway of applying for grants, as well as getting their IDs and ensuring that from school they're able to go to tertiary, that isn't borne out by the statistics that we have on hand. The child-headed households, of course, are a great concern because a number of SASSA officers struggle to give grants to child-headed households for the children. So we're looking at households that have potential, the single source of food being, of course, the school feeding scheme. That's the one aspect which is of concern. And the other being, of course, that where children are not able to be supported by the networks that come with being part of families, that leaves them incredibly destitute.
Isobel, I mean, there's a lot to unpack here in as far as this survey is concerned. But like you say, it does give us a clear indication and picture in terms of, how households are currently coping. But thank you so much for your time this afternoon. That's Isobel Frye, and she, of course, is from the Social Policy Initiative Executive Director.